of course, is another moment where I know you've all had a lot of questions about how these judges are allowed to step in, how they're allowed to do a lot of these things that they're allowed to do to kind of thwart the president's plans. This is happening now once again, and this had to do, Will, with President Trump's push to deport more people, criminals, and at the last second, it kind of all broke loose.
The president signed an executive action on Friday night invoking the Alien Enemies Act. That's a 1798 law. It's been used 3 different times in American history: War of 1812, World War I, and World War II. This law isn't without controversy. It has been debated much, but one thing still stands is that it exists on the books. Congress
has been used for 80 years.
And Congress has not done anything about changing this law, which they have the right to do and could do. However, he invoked it. They didn't advertise that he signed this executive order, which is unusual because normally there's a lot of fanfare around these executive actions. They started getting together these members of Tren de Aragua to export them to El Salvador, where El Salvador has agreed to hold them in their prisons there.
So this was happening all in kind of real time.
Right.
So this was a moment, unlike sometimes when these blocks have come in, they've come in really when it's still almost in theory. It's like court theory. It's, should we allow this? Should we not allow this? This was all happening at the same moment. There are planes being loaded up. There are planes taking off at the same time the ACLU tried to step in.
ACLU finds out about it, rushes to court in Washington state, where they get a judge to issue a 14-day pause on this while they can have hearings about whether it's a constitutional use of this power. This power allows for the deportation of enemies of the United States that are not U.S. citizens without due process. It's not in the immigration law. It's in a wartime powers law. And now there are people trying to argue there's no wartime. But I think that people are going to find out how broad wartime can affect people when you think about the global war on terror. This is a group that has been now designated a terrorist organization, foreign terrorist organization, by the United States State Department. So there's a lot of untested legal theory here. There is a lot of court cases and hearings to come, I do believe. But what now the left is crying foul on is that this is a constitutional crisis because 2 planes took off. They had over 200 members of these gangs being taken to El Salvador. The ACLU's suit was based off 5 of those individuals. And the court order comes down and says you have to halt doing this. However, 2 of these planes were already over the Yucatan Peninsula, well out of United States jurisdiction and territory. Those planes did not turn around. They landed in El Salvador and delivered the criminal migrants to the El Salvadorians. The left is saying constitutional crisis. The White House is saying there was no jurisdiction. They were over international waters.
We put in the title and everything that was President Trump declares this is war. That's a direct quote.
Criticism that the Alien Enemies Act has only been invoked 3 other times. They were all during times of war. Do you feel that you're using it appropriately right now?
Well, this is a time of war because Biden allowed millions of people, many of them criminals, many of them at the highest level. They emptied jails out. Other nations emptied their jails into the United States. That's an invasion. And these are criminals, many, many criminals, murderers, drug dealers at the highest level, drug lords, people from mental institutions. That's an invasion. They invaded our country. So this isn't, in that sense, this is war.
If you look at the history of the United States, if you go back to the late 1790s, the United States passed 4 laws collectively known as the Alien and Sedition Acts. Those acts essentially gave the president additional powers to imprison, to detain, and to deport enemies of the United States. And so if you look at our southern border, from the perspective of the Trump administration and from the perspective of many Americans, we have experienced an invasion of up to 15 to 20 million illegals, many of whom are criminals, coming across our border. Specifically in this particular case, a Venezuelan gang called Tren de Agua has been accused of engaging in criminal activity, including rape and other serious offenses. And the Trump administration has sought to challenge the authority of federal courts, and they've done so precisely in this case by basically putting together 2 plane loads of Venezuelans and shipping them off to El Salvador. And so the question becomes, does the president have the authority? And number 2, will the court attempt to issue an additional order requiring the president to bring these criminals back? That's the essence of the case.
A war in a different context, but Professor Hutchinson, I guess you can at least see where he's coming from, saying we're talking about drug dealers at the highest level. We're talking about drug lords, criminals, murderers. Sure, it's not the traditional sense of a war with another country, but in many ways, it has been an ongoing battle, really for the last, however long, but really for the last few years, as the fentanyl crisis has skyrocketed and all of this has happened, to now say we got to do something about it. So if you have to evoke certain rules, they're there for a reason.
I think you're precisely correct. And so you are also correct, though, in focusing on the victims. So if you look at, for instance, fentanyl, if you look, for instance, at the country of Canada, Canada has lost more of its citizens to fentanyl than they lost in World War II. And Canada lost more citizens on a per capita basis in World War II than the United States did. And so if you now apply the numerical data to the United States is losing tens of thousands of Americans. And so we are, in some sense, at war with these criminal gangs, and the president is trying to address it.
That's right. And this act also, when it talks about the declared war in portion of it, but it also says that it can apply in cases where a foreign government has perpetrated, attempted, or threatened an invasion or predatory incursion of the U.S. I think the term foreign government in many cases has changed and morphed in the fact that these pseudo-states, whether it be cartels or gangs that normally operate territory, have an infrastructure and vast reserves of cash and the ability to perpetrate predatory incursions. It may not be that it is Mexico or Venezuela themselves, but they have kind of a pseudo-state activity when it comes to these vast criminal organizations, much like the Islamic State, which, while they wanted to be their own state, weren't recognized as a country of the United Nations and welcomed into the fold. That didn't stop the Americans, the American government and military from doing actions as if they were a foreign power and state.